Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we are reviewing Dune Part 2. Directed by Denis Villeneuve, Dune Part 2 picks up where Dune left off and follows Paul Atreides as he unites with the Fremen people of the desert planet Arrakis to wage war against House Harkonnen. The film stars Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Rebecca Ferguson, Josh Brolin, Stellan Skarsgård, Dave Bautista, and many more. So Jeffrey, what do you think about Dune Part 2?
Denis Villeneuve is a French-Canadian filmmaker. I think somebody who started off more in the foreign independent sphere and then slowly made his way to blockbuster filmmaking, or more, I don't want to say Hollywood filmmaking exactly because that has a negative connotation, but I more mean that he was making bigger budget fare. But I think he's always been very true to who he is as a director. He's always had this fairly solemn tone. He's always had a very heavy subject matter that he likes to explore in his films. I first encountered him with a film called Incendies that was nominated for Best International Feature or Best Foreign Film back then. I thought was quite good, and then he made a more international breakthrough with Prisoners and has been steadily making some very good films since then. Dune Part 2, I found the visuals of the film to be utterly worthwhile and spectacular. And I mean that in both the sense of finely tuned, frankly borderline groundbreaking visual sequences and its spectacle. From a visual perspective, I'm not sure it could be improved. I think it's virtually perfect. But I have to admit, I am a lot less enamored with the writing aspects of the film. When we talk about a film being well directed, visual aspect is one part of things. There's many other parts of things. And I think that Villeneuve, being known for this kind of heavy, dark subject matter, in the film, it becomes sort of ponderous after a while. There's a fine line between pummeling darkness and feeling the weight of something on your shoulders. I know this is a high example, but say something like The Zone of Interest, it does that. But I felt more disconnected from this film than I expected to. Even more so disconnected than I did from the first film, interestingly enough.
Okay.
So I'm interested in exploring that with you because in a lot of ways, it seems like a bigger achievement in a lot of ways. But at the same time, I felt fairly numb through it.
So I'll have things to say about that, and I think I'm going to understand exactly where you're coming from because I have a lot of the same discrepancies with the film. However, what I will make a point of saying is that I don't think they bothered me as much as maybe they bothered you. And I think that the first Dune movie really set me up for my expectations on this film because I saw it as more of a aesthetic visual spectacular than I did a narrative triumph. I thought this movie was going to follow in the same vein, and it did. But what I will say is that I do have a lot of criticisms on the narrative side. When I reflect on the movie, I noticed them a little bit more as I started writing notes. So I have a bunch of things to say, but I do want to go back to just the visual spectacle that this movie is because there's clearly so much attention to the details in these visual effects, but not only how great they look, but how well they're married with the practical effects of this movie and the practical sets. It's really hard to tell the difference, even though that we know the sandworms aren't real, and we know the backdrops to a lot of the buildings have to be done in with a blue or green screen. With that said, you don't know where those things end. You only know they do because of our understanding of what can possibly exist in this world.
Yeah.
Not just sandworms.
I said this of the first Dune film too, and you said it in so many words, is that you really can't tell where the practical effects start and the visual effects or the computer generated effects begin. I don't say lightly that I think this has some of the most interesting and creative visual effects I've seen in a film ever. We're given access to these grand palaces, places of worship with these beautiful reflective pools in the middle of them, this spellbinding gladiator sequence that's filmed in black and white. The film is just an absolute visual feast. And in addition, I haven't looked into whether it was done on a set or whether it was filmed on location, but filming in a desert environment, I mean, you could feel the tactile, the sand in your fingers as you're watching the film. In addition to the visual effects, I actually think what I could deduce or what I could decipher that was part of cinematography was pretty astounding here, especially with the use of shadows, the use of flashes in the film. It reminds me a lot of Ridley Scott, particularly Gladiator or the way shadows are used in the original Blade Runner film.
Yeah.
You can certainly see that Villeneuve is very influenced by Ridley Scott, and I think that he's an amazing to what Ridley Scott does.
Yeah, and really just to focus on these wide shots, these angles that bring about an understanding of place and location and really bringing us into a world.
Can I go negative now?
Jeffrey has a lot to talk about in this movie.
I do.
I know he has a lot of...
Yeah, okay. So I talked a little bit about how Denis Villeneuve films always have this dark atmosphere. I think that this is the first time that it starts to get the best of him, because at a certain point, the portentous atmosphere just doesn't seem to be in service of anything. The best way I can talk about this is there are a variety of quiet conversations that suddenly become loud out of nowhere. And once I noticed that, it started to really aggravate me. Dave Bautista does it in virtually every scene that he's in, and then Timothée Chalamet starts to do it. The only way that you can say something is important or significant is to yell it. It just seemed like really infantile directing to me.
Okay.
There's been this somewhat controversial thing that he said a couple of days ago, that he thinks film is a purely visual medium and he wants to make silent films and he hates dialogue. And I'm like, maybe he hates dialogue because he's bad at it. Like he doesn't write it well and he doesn't direct it well. What?
Okay. I think the dialogue is one of the things I had a big gripe with in this movie, because personally I felt like it just wasn't deep enough, or there wasn't enough of it. Him having that quote makes a lot of sense in my head now. And this is going to sound pretty bad, but it reminded me of when a student in English class would not read the material, the source material, and they would go on Spark Notes, then come in class and just have all the bullet points.
It's perfect.
So I know that sounds a bit harsh.
No, really, because...
Wait, I didn't finish my point.
Sorry.
I understand that the novel is so sprawling that there is so much to fit in a 3-hour film. I get that. But the film leaps from like these important moments to another important moment. All of a sudden, Timothée Chalamet's character, Paul, he is going from trying to get the appreciation of the Fremen people. All of a sudden, the next sequence is him riding the gigantic worm and suddenly becoming a part of their tribe. Like, there's a whole in between there that they just completely ignore.
If this is one of those solemn, let's all march to our deaths sort of blockbusters, in my mind, you have to compensate for the lack of emotional resonance that the film is naturally going to have with some sort of philosophical, intellectual resonance. And when I was really aggravated last night, I was texting a friend of ours, and I felt like the novel was an invitation to a conversation, and the film is more like one of those signs you would buy at Target that has like a vague saying on it. I'm sorry. This movie's not that bad. It's really not that bad. I'm sorry. I don't mean it.
Really isn't that bad.
Yeah, no, it's really not that bad.
We're gonna get so many haters in the comments if we continue on this path.
Yeah, but I'm not sure the film is inviting you to a conversation. I'm not sure it's interrogating its subject matter or examining it in any way beyond these vague platitudes. So there are a lot of lines in the films where characters just say things like, people need something to believe in, or ideas and stories are powerful. And they treat that more like the answer to a question rather than the starting point of an examination. And that's what really bothered me about the film. A lot of people are going to go see this film and they're just going to have an amazing time because the visual splendor is just outrageous. It cannot be overstated how amazing it is. My mind and like the way that I watch films and my personal tastes, I always get hung up on storytelling, on character development, on thematic material. Like, these are the things that just like my literary brain needs to love a film.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's why I get stuck on those things.
I think it's pretty obvious you're a very deeply intellectual person, and I think those expectations you put on film, you seek that and you search for it and you criticize film, I think rightfully so, for lacking those things.
Sometimes if a film is dark, but I don't feel like the film is earning it with some sort of intellectual backing, then I get a little more aggravated with it. When we saw John Wick 4 and I came out raving about it, it's because to me that film wasn't trying to go in an intellectual direction at all. It more makes me feel like Dune is trying to say something, but what it's saying is really not that interesting. It's like playing a charade.
I do want to get back a little bit more to the positives, and there's going to be some criticisms built into here as well. But there are so many characters. This is an ensemble piece of people in this film. I want to start first with Timothée Chalamet because I thought he was really good in the film. Naturally, what can happen with main characters in these types of films is that they can seem quite less interesting compared to the supporting characters in the film. Ask people what their favorite Harry Potter character is or their most interesting Harry Potter character is, and I could bet you like not many people are going to say Harry Potter himself.
A lot of my friends growing up were rooting for him to die in the last book. They were just like, everyone around him is so interesting.
Exactly. You're probably more likely to say like Luna Lovegood or Sirius Black or Snape. I think what it is that we're so used and accustomed to the hero's journey, it isn't really interesting to us anymore. That characters that go through the hero journey are pretty bland. With that expectation in mind, I think he really does hold his own in the film. I felt like he was really great at balancing these soft and gentle moments with these more serious and commanding moments that happen later on in the film. He does get louder, he does get more commanding of a room, and his presence grows. And I think he really does a great job of doing that. I think that makes the end all that more destructive because you have this sense of sincerity about him that you really believe in. Without that, I feel like the end of the movie doesn't come crushing down with as much weight.
I agree. And I also think that when I first heard about this casting, we're thinking like the Elio from Call Me By Your Name is going to play like this Duke in Dune. Anyway, I think he sounds oddly miscast, but I think he shows that us as viewers have put him in a box too much as like the cute boy from this thing. I thought his performance was quite good, actually. I think in any way that it's miscalculated is actually more to do with the pacing and the direction and the way that scenes are edited to escalate tension. Sometimes they just escalate tension a little too fast when I wasn't on that wavelength. I think it's actually more to do with that than his performance. I thought his performance was pretty darn good, actually, and most of the acting in the movie is very good.
I want to get to Zendaya because I have absolutely no complaints of her as an actress, but I couldn't help but feel like she was being underutilized in this movie. And I don't mean that by the amount of screen time she has. I mean that by the way that her role is utilized in the film from the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie. I feel like she starts this movie complaining about how messiahs don't exist and following a messiah will be the downfall of us all. And then she ends the movies complaining about the same exact thing in the same exact way.
Yeah, see, that could have been the springboard to the conversation that the film was missing and the examination that it's missing of its themes.
Yeah, and I feel like the movie missed this opportunity to focus on how her convictions don't change throughout the movie, that she stays the same. I think that's an important aspect of her character is that she does not change, but it's not focused on in the movie at all, so it doesn't really mean anything in the end. But the only reason I bring this up is because I think she's an amazingly talented actress. I think of 2021's Malcolm and Marie, her acting performance in that film. I know you've seen Euphoria and you say a lot of great things about her in that show. She has a lot of versatility in her acting capabilities. I feel like the movie did not pay attention enough to her character to give her enough to chew on and do make something really great out of.
Yeah, I agree. And that character is so crucial to the film because she's the lone dissenter and amongst all of these other people who are following Paul to where he's going that it feels like such a missed opportunity. I don't want to keep coming back to the same point, but Austin Butler's performance and the character that he plays does lack a lot of nuance, but I do think is pretty menacing. Like, I found him to be a pretty scary individual who I certainly wanted to see die, and that's how we feel about villains.
I think the reason that works is because I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think the reason that works so well is because Dave Bautista's character is his brother in the movie. He's all over the place, like, emotionally. And I think he comes in, Austin Butler's character, and there is no limits to what he will or will not do. And you get that immediately. And I think that's what makes him so menacing. But on that note of Austin Butler, I do want to talk briefly about the ending. One of the things I did love about the movie was its tightrope-like balance of spectacle and quiet reflection. I felt like the film wasn't rushing itself through the calmer moments to get to each climactic battle sequence. In the end, I loved how the balance of power really came down to a controlled and agreed upon fight between two people. I found this fight to be both like climactic and anticlimactic at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. I like the way that was handled.
And the reason I like that so much is because some movies have this tendency to make these fight sequences last forever and be so intricate. I always watch these films and I'm like, how do people have the energy to get through these fight sequences? I would be on the ground like heaving to gasp for air at this point. They didn't fall into those sim pitfalls. It was gritty, it was quick, and that made it all the more grounded and realistic to me. On a positive note about character development, I want to talk about Javier Bardem because I thought he was probably the best character in the movie, I would say.
Yeah, maybe aside from Paul. I think Paul has some development, but yeah.
I think the reason his character was so good was he's one of the few people that's actually grappling with the understanding of a deity. He is obviously a believer from the very beginning of the film, but his belief slowly deepens throughout the movie and becomes more fanatical. The level of devotion that he has to this idea, the way it slowly builds and grows throughout the movie, is I thought one of the more spectacular aspects of it. It's what I wish was handled with all the other characters.
Yeah, totally.
And he's also one of the most hilarious figures in the movie.
Yeah, a lot of his humor, I think, is born in the gravity of the situation, which helps to give some levity to the film because the film doesn't have a lot of levity, so it's welcome whenever it's there.
On that note, I want to talk a little bit about the main theme of the movie, which is religion.
Religious fundamentalism, but
yes, that's what I would say.
Christian friends.
Yeah, I would say religious fundamentalism. It's almost like the fanaticism of religion. Humanity itself becomes sort of controlled by it. Her character remarks in the film, the type of people that we are, nobody is above anybody else, and we all care for each other. And by the end of this movie, they become a people that really end up worshiping one particular person, which I think is very interesting.
I don't think it's that interesting.
Okay. All right. Tough crowd. So you ready to go to grades?
I'm going to give Dune a B, which is funny because I complain about it a lot. But
You did.
I just think that for me to undermine how much work went into this film and how extraordinary it is from a visual perspective would just be like an utter disservice to the filmmakers. I really think they botched a lot with the story. I obviously from the way I was talking about it, but I can't just say that all of the other things that, bothered me a little less aren't without value. I read the novel Dune a long time ago, so I really remember more how I felt when I was reading it than I remember the actual cadence of events, so to speak. But I did think that this replicated most of the feeling of being in that world, even if it didn't replicate a lot of the intellectual aspects of the novel. In some ways, it actually reminded me of Zack Snyder's adaptation of Watchmen. Aside from one or two events, is a pretty faithful adaptation of the graphic novel, but you leave it feeling not at all the way you did when you left the graphic novel, saying, wow, that really changed the way I think about various things. It's really interesting to see something mostly faithfully adapted, but yet losing some of whatever that strange magic was that the book had. I think even without the source material, and maybe I would be more harsh on it without the source material now that I think of it, because I'm filling in a lot of the blanks from my memory with the story here. But even without that source material, I just don't know that this is a very compelling story.
I understand that. I don't think anybody who watches this movie and comes away saying that was a very compelling story, I don't know how many people are actually would say that.
You need to get on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
People are losing their minds about this
they are?
movie. I don't know. I'm rage tweeting at all of them.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I have to go unprotected soon. People keep finding me on Twitter. You can't see the things I say.
From a spectacle sense, I did lose my mind in the theater. I was very entirely gripped by just the overall feeling of it. I felt like my arms were on pins and needles at certain points, especially that end fight, because I felt it was so real and there was real stakes to it. But I think on a deeper level, I think the movie is lacking. But that being said, like I said earlier, I didn't really care. I understood coming from the first movie what I was to expect from this film, and I didn't think it was going to be any more than the first film was already giving me. I really had a good time enjoying this visual splendor. So I give it a B+. He has this capability of going to that deeper level. So I don't know what his comment about hating dialogue is for, because I feel like it could have come in really good use here to at least had something really well written. I feel like he excelled better in Arrival in Blade Runner 2049 in those areas, but maybe just that wasn't the intention.
Yeah, I said to you on the way out from the film, I used the example of The Dark Knight. So if The Dark Knight came out tomorrow, would I still think it's this giant cinematic achievement that's philosophically resonant and smart and exciting all at once? And we feel that way every time we rewatch The Dark Knight. And I was thinking about that particular sequence with Morgan Freeman when they're using the surveillance to find the Joker at the end of the film, and how Morgan Freeman takes a line in the sand. He takes a moral stance and he says, this is wrong. We're going to do this once, but after this is wrong.
Yeah.
And how interesting that is, because it literally helps them save people's lives, but as they're admitting that it's wrong. So in a way, that's a film inviting you to a conversation. And that's only a 10-minute segment of The Dark Knight. I actually do think that I would think that film is quite an achievement if it came out tomorrow, because it's inviting you to the conversation. It's inviting you to the examination in a way that this film isn't. I try to go through these checks and balances in my mind, and I say, well, do you just think this film is not as good because you just didn't feel it as much? Maybe you feel The Dark Knight more, and that's why you're lighter on it. So then I started going through these exercises in my head. But anyway, that's what I came up with.
All right, and that's it for our very interesting review on Dune Part 2. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about Dune Part 2? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.